After as prosperous a journey as be expected at this late season of the year, I arrived at my seat the day before Christmas.
With these words, George Washington told of his return to Mt Vernon in 1783. The Revolution was over, and from the noise of battle he would come to the peace and privacy of his first Christmas at home in 9 long years. At last, familiar hall. Now he was back to the sight of familiar little things in his own room and to the privacy of his own thoughts. In a letter to a friend, he spoke of the change in his life.
I am at length become a private citizen of America, and free from the bustle of camp and intrigues of court, I shall view the busy world with serenity of mind.
Now he could unpack his battle equipment and put it away among his memories of fateful events that now were history. The sight of the enemy routed from Boston, his forced retreat from Long Island with the British at his heels, the bitter defeat at Brandywine that left the Americans in peril until aid from France opened the way to the final great victory at Yorktown. The commander-in-chief who had ordered the bugle call on the field of battle could become once more the country squire who answered the call of the hunting horn and the claim of his own peaceful fields. Here at Mt Vernon, he still followed the customs of England. Although freedom from British rule had been won in the space of a few years, the culture of the old world would not give way so quickly to that of the new. Even after the Revolution, George Washington looked out from his house over land and buildings that still expressed the way of life of an English planter in colonial Virginia. And whether as a loyal subject of the king, or now as a citizen of a new and independent nation, he was always proud of Mt Vernon, which he described in a letter.
It lies in a high, dry, and healthy country on one of the finest rivers in the world, in a latitude between the extremes of heat and cold.
He loved the life of a farmer best of all, but the soil to which he now returned was far from rich. He had changed his crops from tobacco and corn to wheat and grass in order to conserve his land. He now cultivated more than 2,000 acres, well stocked with sheep, horses, cows, pigs, and fowl. He trained his apple and pear trees to French and English methods adapted to his own soil and climate. His studies of other homes seen on his travels led him to plant poplars and boxwood in formal patterns, thus an outlet plantation. But rather than a wealthy country gentleman playing with a hobby, he was a vigorous and enterprising farmer who had to work his soil hard for a livelihood. His crops went to market as far as the West Indies. From his kitchen garden came honey and spice for his own table. The produce of his vines and vegetable beds provided food for his family and household, and for passing guests resting from travel through the surrounding wilderness. Mt Vernon included 5 farms, surveyed on a map by the general himself. He had enlarged by more than 3 times the property he had acquired through his half-brother Lawrence. The Washington family had originally been given the land by a document signed in the name of that same British royal house from which the general had now set his country free. In a little more than 100 years, a piece of wilderness in the first English colony of the New World had been made into a civilized and productive American homestead that could now provide for itself. To meet its needs, its plan included many different buildings called dependencies. Each one had a special function in the complex business of keeping a large community clothed and fed. On the simple implements in the spinning house, the women folk turned out 1,000 yards of cloth a year from wool, cotton, and flax gathered on the estate. From these fabrics came most of the clothing and linen used by the people of Mt Vernon. In the wash house, the laundresses did a big chore every week, made bigger by the lack of running water. The articles needed for getting and boiling the water, for making soap, and for drying and distributing the wash had to be made right on the place. Just as the meat consumed at Mt Vernon had to come from its own livestock. Enough beef, mutton, and pork was cured in the smokehouse to fill the year-round needs of 250 people who worked on the estate. A plantation manager who lived in a house by himself had charge of all their labor, whether farming the land or keeping the gardens, or building and painting the houses or making the tools needed for their jobs. He worked under orders from the general, who, as proprietor, watched over everything and everyone. Keeping a careful record of all that was produced and stored on his farms, or with fatherly care sending food from his own kitchen to nourish those who were sick or injured, the general set the policy that kept Mt Vernon going. He was always planning something new, and so his grounds and buildings kept on growing, each a part of the other. With his own brick and oak timber, he had gradually improved a small house of 1.5 stories until it became a mansion with 3 floors and 20 rooms. And now, after the Revolution, he completed a new type of piazza, his own original contribution to colonial architecture, like his extensive use of pine sheathing, which was beveled, painted, and covered with sand to withstand the elements and look like stone.
I have a large room which I intend to finish in a plain, neat style. Independent of present taste is my choice.
He thanked a friend for sending him the mantel for his new room.
The chimney pieces arrived. Too elegant and costly by far, I fear, for my Republican style of living.
But he set it up, for it was a gift from England. Like other useful and decorative household objects that came from abroad, it took its place among things made by local craftsmen. His house was like America. Many cultures were forming it, and then were being formed into something new. Life was comfortable here, but it never exceeded the modesty of the 2 people who had taken their wedding breakfast at this table. Theirs was a simple and charming life. Yet, like families on other remote farms of that time, they could fulfill a desire to have beautiful things around them. Sitting in the evening in their west parlor, in front of a landscape painted to order for the panel beneath a family coat of arms, they could rest from the heavy duties of managing a farm and a household. Here, George and Martha Washington could talk over all the details of the full life that they were to share for nearly 40 years. With no children of their own, they extended to her children by a former marriage the responsibility, dignity, and love that composed their life together. And into their home they took her grandchildren, George Washington Parke and Nellie Custis, who filled the house with laughter and the sound of youthful fingers practicing on the harpsichord and flute. Sometimes Nellie grew weary of her music lesson, for life could be such fun on a plantation like Mt Vernon. Lessons came first, of course, but there were games and parties, too, and how she could make the general laugh by mimicking some of his important visitors. Her charm was enhanced by the beauty and warmth of this house, where she was later to be married. The gifted young girl who grew up in this room was trained by her grandmother to be a good housekeeper. And like young ladies in Europe at that time, this young gentlewoman of America became accomplished in the arts of decoration. Her fingers learned to do needlepoint, for in those days decoration meant making things. She was given art lessons too, and taught to paint a still life on silk. But the hands that worked so delicately on peaches, plums, and grapes were also taught to use them in more practical ways. In Mt Vernon's busy kitchen, she learned how to provide meals for a large establishment and its many guests. The menu on record for a typical dinner included roast beef, leg of boiled pork, mutton chops, and goose, hominy and potatoes, cabbage, onions, and pickles, mince pies, cheese, port, and Madeira. The cook had to know how to build many different kinds of fires and what the timing must be for each one. The general compared Mt Vernon to a well-resorted tavern, for his kitchen provided food for a great many guests. And his house was no ordinary meeting place. Statesmen and thinkers like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Patrick Henry, and former comrades in arms like Major Horatio Gates and the Marquis de Lafayette came together here with other important men of the day. Their exchange of ideas later influenced history. Some of the thoughts on democracy first shared in this room were eventually written into our Constitution by men who first met here and talked across the dinner table. Words of freedom spoken here were joined with liberal thought across the sea, carried home by the young Frenchman Lafayette, who had fought for American liberty and who later presented his host with the key to the Bastille, the royal prison in Paris, a symbol of tyranny which he helped to destroy during the French Revolution. A replica made from its ruined stone was given to the general. And with the key came a message from Lafayette. It is a tribute which I owe as a son to my adoptive father, as an aide-de-camp to my general, as a missionary of liberty to its patriarch. Thus a house guest acknowledged a debt to hospitality, for at Mt Vernon Lafayette felt at home, sleeping in the room which ever afterwards bore his name, and strolling with his host in the flower garden, whose formal patterns made him think of his own land across the sea. Here also the general could walk alone among his tulips and his sweet William. And perhaps in this quiet retreat, he thought sometimes about the young and unsettled nation to which his life had been devoted. Now he might hope to spend the rest of his days working peacefully on his farm, where land, buildings, and people were forming a harmonious and productive community under his leadership. But his hope was not to be fulfilled. The nation needed its leader again. The states had not yet learned to live together, and George Washington feared that unless they remained united, the result might be anarchy, breeding ground of tyranny. In the fateful year, 1789, he answered the summons to become the first president of the United States.
I bade adieu to Mt Vernon, to private life, and to domestic felicity. And oppressed with anxious and painful sensations, set out for New York to render service to my country in obedience to its cause.
The same stewardship that had created Mt Vernon now brought the states together in a strong federal union. As he had built his house, so he built our government on a foundation that was firm. 8 years later, a grateful people allowed him to return to Mt Vernon at last. With more than 60 years behind him, he was happy to retire to the peace and comfort of life with his family on his farm. Sitting at his desk, he replied to the homage paid him by citizens of high and low estate all over the world. Here he had drafted many of the ideas to which free men would always claim allegiance. Now he could devote his attention to the writings of other men in other lands. In these last years of his life, he could spend more time in the privacy of his library. He spoke of the education of future Americans.
In proportion as the structure of a government gives force to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened.
George Washington knew that men could achieve an enlightened wisdom only through practical knowledge in all matters concerning their welfare and their freedom. For his was a knowing brought to life by doing, a creative process symbolized by the motto in his bookplate, Exitus acta probat. The result of actions proves their worth. But the days of a life must come to an end. In the last month of 1799, the General Secretary wrote a letter. It read, "About 3 o'clock on Saturday morning, he became ill. Every aid that medicine could give was administered, but between 10 and 11 o'clock at night, he resigned his breath into the hand that gave it." Through the steadfastness of purpose and the courage by which he lived, George Washington has taken his place among the men who have led the world forward. His life has become our life. Like many pioneers and farmers, he lies buried at his own request on the grounds of his own home. And when we pay tribute at his grave, we are also able to admire the harvest of his life. We can feel the force of the spirit that was caught by the great sculptor Houdin over 150 years ago, and is evident in every part of the shrine we can visit today. Here at Mt Vernon, we can see an American home that was built when the country was changing, and its people were fearful but hopeful. We who make a pilgrimage here today live in a world that is also changing. We too know fear, but we have hope. And as in that other time, we are concerned about the way of life that we are building. It is important for us to be reminded how seeds grow when they are carefully planted, how walls stand when they are set on roots, and how ideas of citizenship flower in the soil of liberty. It is not an empty house of memories of the dead. It is an American meeting place where we recognize the living beauty, the order, and the dignity that George Washington built into the structure of our free republic.